clues, months, Masoretes, and mistranslations all begin with the letter M in English. In Hebrew, only one of these words actually begins with the letter M. In the early 2000s, before the Common Era, this is what the letter M looked like, the letter Mem. What did it represent? Well, in Hebraic thought, it meant water, blood, and chaos. The letter Mem represents the scope of today's presentation perfectly. A lot of chaos over the centuries that obscured the truth. We're going to discuss 3 words key to answering a riddle unanswered for centuries. And these clues are found where there is water and blood. So let's move ahead. We have a lot of ground to cover. Well, it happened. The day after uploading this video, the subject bool was brought to my attention. In the video Yom 3 Elohim, the 3rd word, we referenced 1 Kings 6:38, but we only relied on the English translations of this verse. After all, the English translations found on the Bible Gateway website say that bool is the 8th month. Well, that is except for one. Let's take a look. Beginning with the American Standard Version and following through on all these different pages, well, there is one exception. The Living Bible actually states that it was in November. They don't use the word month or the word bool at all when they're translating this particular verse. We continue on, but our question is this what the Hebrew verse found in Scripture says? And is it so important? Well, we think so. So here we will see the Hebrew text, and it reads right to left, and in year the 11th, in moon yarach bool, it the Chodesh, the 8th, completed the house to all his words and to all his judgments, and he was building it 7 years. Pull this together. Right here we have in Yarach, which means in moon bool, Strong's 3391. The second combination is HaKodesh, the 8th Kodesh, Strong's 2320. This interpretation of Scripture, it also appears in the prior verse in 1 Kings 6:37. In Yarach, in moon Ziv, and in the 4th year. Even if you don't read Hebrew, those Hebrew letters, they aren't there. In this particular verse, they're translating it as month, but Kodesh isn't there. Why? When we look at Strong's, Yarach says it's a month. We don't think so. A calendar month. He also says it could be a moon. We have changed in red from months to moons because it will affect the translation and understanding, as well as revealing some very interesting facts if you were to retain moon instead of months. So let's compare. We have 3391 Yarach, and it's an unused fruit of uncertain signification. And then 3394, Yareach, it's from the same root. And yet one says month, the other says moon. The only thing that's different here is the vowel pointings, which we are going to argue this point as being influenced by a theological point of view. For more than 1,000 years, only the consonants were written down. The vowels needed for pronunciation had to be supplied by the reader. In the 4th millennium, the 9th through the 6th century BCE, the first solution was attempted, adding these consonants and using them as vowels, adding them at the end of words. The second stage was after the Babylonian exile. This time, the consonants used to represent vowels, like the yod and the vav, they were going to be added within words. Now, the final stage began the reform of the text 100 years later, from the 7th to the 10th centuries. but it wasn't until the 10th century CE that the Hebrew scholars were ready for standardization. The Masoretes, which literally means the masters of the tradition. They took on organizing the Hebrew scriptures, developing a system of vowel and stress marks that could be added to already existing manuscripts. By doing so, they were able to precisely fix or establish the pronunciation, and by doing so helped to define the meaning of the Hebrew Bible text. Cantillation was also a focus because the text is not only meant to be read, but it's to be sung. And not less important, scribal correction. All this was necessary because of the variety of Hebrew text alterations throughout the years, and sometimes based on regional differences. Two main schools or families of Masoretes were Moshe ben David ben Naphtali and Aaron ben Moshe ben Asher. They each created slightly different Masoretic texts, but the Ben Asher version prevailed and forms the basis of the modern biblical text today. The Aleppo Codex is dated by scholars to have been written about 929-930 AD, and this codex is the most complete copy of the Hebrew Old Testament in existence today. Here is the Ben Asher version known as Aleppo Codex. These pages are from 1 Kings. Here we find 1 Kings 6, verses 37 and 38. Let me tell you, I was never more grateful for chapter and verse numbers available today than when I tried to find these two verses in a 593-page document. The scribes were paid by the letter, not the page. So it goes that they wrote letters incredibly close to each other. So this was very difficult for me to find this, but there it is. It can't be overstated that by the time this manuscript was completed, the tradition of using a lunar calendar was already in place for more than 1,500 years. Recall that the Masoretic text was completed by the masters of the tradition. From the period of the Babylonian exile, the Israelites adopted many of the Babylonian calendar customs, including Babylonian month names. They also used the sighted crescent moon to begin the month, and they shared in common belief that the day began at sunset. We also have a few names from the Canaanite customs that were retained, and we find them in Scripture, and those are Aviv, Ziv, Ethanim, and Bual. But were they month names or were they moon names? The evolvement of the Hebrew calendar could be divided into just three parts, beginning with the biblical period, 3,286 years from day one to just 284 years after Solomon's temple was dedicated to Elohim. They begin to fall away. Stage 1. Here we have the beginning of altering the text. Is it a coincidence? I'm not sure. But we have the Babylonian exile beginning in 605 with the deportation of the Judean nobility. And it continues with the capture of Jerusalem, the temple being destroyed. Stage 2 begins after Solomon's temple is destroyed. Another deportation, and then Nebuchadnezzar's empire is to fall. By the time you get to the Aleppo Codex, the final stage, the time period between these events is about a little over 1,500, if not, one could consider 1,600 years, if you include the time period of 70 years before the first deportation to Babylon. So after returning to Jerusalem, the Hebrews continued to use the Babylonian calendar for about a century. But they had another influence, Alexander the Great. He also embraced a new moon calendar. It was the official calendar of the Greeks. And when he conquered the Middle East in the 4th century, he introduced his lunar calendar, and it was gradually accepted by most of the people. But after the Jewish Hasmonean state broke off from its Hellenistic overlords in the mid-2nd century BCE, the Jewish people no longer had any reason to comply with the calendar of the distant Babylon, and their calendar soon acquired distinct features. The Talmudic period founded a confidential council known as Sod Ha-Edi Bebor to make their calendar clear by searching out the matter, and then the fixing of the lengths of the months and the intercalation of months was the prerogative of a council consisting of the president plus 2 to 6 members of the Sanhedrin who were skilled in astronomy and mathematics. So for the next 800 years, until the mid-4th century, the Calendar Council set the religious and secular calendar for the Jews of Jerusalem and the growing diaspora. Every month they were tasked with setting the first day of each month by direct observation of the moon's phases, and determining whether the extra leap month was required to maintain the balance. The solar year is not the same length as a lunar year. Now, over those 800 years, different rules and adjustments were made, and in the 3rd century CE, new rules said that the first day of Rosh Hashanah, which happens in the fall, cannot fall on a Sunday, Wednesday, or Friday, so that Yom Kippur wouldn't fall on or near Sabbath. So by the early part of the 4th century, Rabbi Hillel put a fixed calendar in place so that people would know in advance when the festivals would occur and when they could more or less safely plant crops. So no longer were they relying on the observation of the moon. This was a truly calculated calendar. That's the 3rd part. And this is known as the post-Talmudic period. That was a big overview. The Empire of Alexander really did have a very big effect on the Hebrew people. Not just did he introduce a lunar calendar, the Greek culture brought in by Alexander influenced some of the Jewish people. He had conquered Egypt, and he began to unify his world, a process called Hellenization. And the corrupting influence of Hellenism on the Aaronic priesthood led to their loss of favor and brought outrage among the common people, from which came the Hasidim and the subsequent rise of the Hasidim. They were the progenitors, actually, of the Pharisees, a grassroots movement of pious Jews who stood for the old-time religion of Moses and the prophets. They're attributed to writing the book of Enoch that was found in Qumran. The books of Enoch consisted of multiple parts that were put together as one book by a later editor. The book consists of the following parts. Of these parts, the Book of the Luminaries is considered by scholars the oldest document, dated around 300 to 201 BCE. This is an important date. To give you some perspective, this dating is no earlier than 23 years after the death of Alexander, who died in Babylon. Now, the scrolls found at Qumran give evidence that a different calendar was being honored by some, the Zadok calendar, also known as the Qumran calendar. And in this, the year begins on the 4th day of the week, corresponding with the creation of the luminaries in Genesis 1:14, because they were created on the 4th day. And there are 12 segments consisting of 30 days each. There are 4 additional intercalary days marking the season at the ends of the 3rd, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th month. So it brings you up to a total of 364 days. 7 times 52 weeks. They truly believed that the calendar was only 364 days. And people are observing this calendar today, so it's not out of vogue. The fixed dates for the major festivals cannot fall on a Sabbath according to this calendar, keeping them separate and distinct, thereby avoiding worrisome difficulties affecting sacrifices. And a particular day of any given month will always fall on the same day of the week every year. The Zadok calendar is based upon the vernal equinox. Essenes renounced the ways of the 2 larger Jewish communities at the time, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and saw themselves as the true inheritors of the Zadokite priestly traditions. They really did rebel against the lunar calendar and not using the moons to start a month. And they did number their segments by what we often find in Scripture, the 1st Kodesh, the 2nd Kodesh, the 3rd Kodesh. So for them, a Kodesh were 30-day units with some intercalation being required. This scroll is also found in Qumran, and the author of Jubilees becomes very specific about a solar calendar. That's where you really hear this is a solar calendar. It comes out of Jubilees. Now, he specifically makes the statement that people will later start following a calendar that is not 364 days, and that's true. And this will cause the people to celebrate the appointed times on the wrong days, and this was a great concern at the time. And the late date of the book is also supported by the fact that the text most closely relates to the text of the Septuagint, yet its text is different enough to show that it does not rely purely on the Septuagint text. So now we get into Antiochus. Oh my gosh, I know this is so much history, but we want you to be able to see how tradition was just enforced and reinforced through the years. By 175 BC, things had reached an intolerable level for many of the less than upper classes in the Hebrew community. In their minds, the upper classes, which included the priesthood, had abandoned the principles of the written Torah, and the book of Maccabees gives us some insight into the Hellenization process. It reached such a pitch, the priests ceased to show any interest in the services of the altar, scorning the temple, neglecting the sacrifices. They'd hurry to take part in the Greek activities, Maccabees tells us. They disdained all that their ancestors had esteemed and highly esteemed things of value related to the Hellenist culture. In 172 BC, King Antiochus appointed Menelaus as Jerusalem's high priest to introduce the Greek way of educating the young people and to completely Hellenize the Hebrew people. Those who were not familiar with the Mosaic law, the priesthood was only to come from the line of Aaron. During this time, the high priest appointment is not as God instructed, but instead to whomever Antiochus chose. And history records that he auctioned the position to the highest bidder. In other words, a bribe, also against the Torah. Take no bribe, for a bribe blinds those who have sight and perverts the words of the righteous. Now, in these men's eyes, perhaps they thought, well, we're not taking a bribe, we're giving a bribe. In either case, it's wrong. It's not in the spirit of the law. In 167, King Antiochus returns to Jerusalem after his second campaign in Egypt, and he immediately banned the Hebrew religion and the Enoch calendar and prohibited all religious practices. You have a dual play. It wasn't just the lunar calendar. You have now the Antiochian, the Zadok calendar going on at the same time. But what did we learn in Yom 3 Elohim? He is El Kanna, a jealous God Would God give us a tool so valuable and integral to how one observes his appointed times by permitting it to be ascribed to a nation, the Babylonian calendar, or a man's name, the Enoch calendar, the Zadok calendar, ascribed to another man's reputation? These three have something in common, however. They all require intercalation. This is the insertion a week, a month of a leap day, as we saw in the Zadok calendar. They had to add 4 days to make it work. And still it's 1 day short of a 365.24 solar calendar. But they had to do this in order to follow the seasons or the moon phases. And what about Deuteronomy 4:2? Do not add a thing to what I command you, nor subtract from it, so that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I am delivering to you. And Deuteronomy 12:32. Everything that I command you, everything you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to it or take from it. Personally, this is the verse that anchored my belief in moving forward to the calendar that we now use here at the Disciples' Table. We did not treat this commandment lightly, but they were not careful. They had perhaps lost their way to calculate the calendar even before they went into captivity. We know that they went into captivity because all the officers of the priests and the people likewise were exceedingly unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations. And they polluted the house of the Lord that he had made holy in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place, but they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. Now, we should not be harsh towards all those trying to search out his truth. We're sensitive to knowing that those who are viewing this video are most probably on a different calendar. It's only because of recent technology that we can discover what we're about to reveal here. If you are trying, then you are to be commended. But test everything. Keep an open mind. Even what is uploaded here. Nothing on this channel is beyond reproach. However, let us rebuke each other in love and strive to separate ourselves from traditions and egos that have blinded us from the straight and narrow path. After understanding the motivation for the writing of the Zadok calendar, we believe that they had a memory of what the biblical calendar might have been. For instance, they numbered their segments, they did not give them names, and they remembered the vernal equinox was of importance. But over the years, lost that knowledge of how to read the heavens as Noah and Moses understood them. For it appears they had no place for the moon at all in this calendar. As I continued to research this topic, in Qumran, they actually do have scrolls where they are recording the new moon and the full moon. And that's important because moons are made for appointed times and they cannot be overlooked. They remembered that it was a solar calendar, and we are now going to show you how we can discern the true biblical calendar. Solomon's temple and the days of Noah will be our template. Full moons. Naming moons. What's in a name? So for millennia, humans have used the movement of the moon to keep track of the passing year. Ancient cultures the world over have given these full moon names based on the behavior of plants, animals, weather, and during a moon cycle, set schedules for hunting, planting, and harvesting. According to the Farmer's Almanac and many sources of folklore, there are typically 12 named full moons every year. For the most part, present-day research focuses only on the names that are geared towards Northern Hemisphere observers. It's important that we take a brief look at them. In January, Wolf Moon, Old Moon, Ice Moon, Moon after Yule, Cherokee, Cold Moon. February, the Snow Moon, Full Hunger Moon, Storm Moon, Cherokee, Bone Moon. Because there was so little food at the time, they had to eat bone marrow for soup. March Moon, Native Americans called the last full moon of winter a worm moon after the worm trails that would appear in the newly thawed ground. Other names like Chase and Death Moon, Crust Moon, in reference to the snow that becomes crusty as it thawed during the day, froze at night, Sap Moon, tapping of maple trees, the Lenten Moon, and the Cherokee Moon, the Wind Moon. Some northern Native Americans call April's full moon the pink moon, after a species of early blooming wildflowers. The Cherokee name was simply flower moon, a time for flower blooms and when the earth is renewed. Yet there still were other names: full fish moon, sprouting grass moon, egg moon by the Anglo-Saxons, and also the Paschal moon, since it was used to estimate the time for Easter. But in some parts, May moon was considered the flower moon, since there were more and more flowers coming. You also had budding moon, egg-laying moon, milk moon, corn planting moon. But in the Celtic and the Old English ways of reckoning the full moon in this period, it was the mother's moon, the bright moon. Hold on to that thought. Hare moon, grass moon. Cherokees simply called it the planting moon. Now the June moon is very easy for me to embrace, the strawberry moon. I used to live in New Jersey in the United States, and that was the time of the harvesting of our strawberries. So aptly, it got the name Strawberry Moon, where the Europeans have dubbed it the Rose Moon. Other cultures named it the Hot Moon for the beginning of the summer heat, or Mead Moon. And because the corn is up, the Cherokee moon name, Green Corn Moon. Traditionally, it was this month, a time for marriages. Europeans used to refer to this full moon as the honeymoon. In North America, male deer shed their antlers every year and begin to regrow them in July. Hence, the North American name for July's full moon, buck moon. And because of the month's many summer storms, some would call it the full thunder moon. Others would include the hay moon after the July hay harvest, the wart moon, and the Cherokee moon in keeping with the corn season, why it was the ripe corn moon. Known as the sturgeon moon by the Northern American fishing tribes, such as the Algonquin, fruit or barley moon, green corn moon, grain moon, red moon. For the reddish hue it often takes on in the summer haze. Cherokee, well, they named their moon end of fruit moon. The most familiar named moon, September's harvest moon. Well, sometimes called the harvest moon. The harvest moon refers to the time of the year after the autumnal equinox, when crops are gathered. It also refers to the moon's particularly bright appearance at early rise, which lets farmers continue harvesting into the night. The harvest moon typically occurs in September. However, it is in October once every 3 years. This is the only full moon name which is determined by the equinox rather than a month. This moon held special importance for the ancients since it allowed them to work their fields for a longer period of time. Other names would be the full corn moon, the barley moon. The Cherokee named it the nut moon, and some of the newer names are the Grail moon and the Laddie moon, which were named after a couple of spacecraft missions. Why do I include that? To let you see that over the course of times, full moons continue to receive names for the same moon, but they change significantly as the ages or geographic locations changed. The first moon after the harvest moon is the hunter's moon, so named as the preferred month to hunt summer fattened deer and fox, unable to hide in now bare fields. Like the harvest moon, the hunter's moon is also particularly bright and long in the sky, giving hunters the opportunity to stalk prey at night. Other names: travel moon, dying grass moon, blood moon, and sanguine moon. Cherokee name, the harvest moon. There is disagreement over the origin of November's beaver moon name. Some say it comes from the Native Americans setting beaver traps during this month, while others say the name comes from the heavy activity of the beavers building their winter dams. Other names include frosty moon, frost moon, oak moon, morning moon, and because there are two different locations of the Cherokee tribes, one called it the trading moon, while another called it the hunting moon. The coming of winter earned December's full moon the name cold moon or long night's moon. Great festivals were attributed to this full moon, such as the Yule festival. Ancients would usually celebrate their ancestors during this full moon, so it was also known as the moon before Yule. You had the drift clearing moon, and the Cherokee named it the snow moon because it usually ended up with their first snowfall. The blue moon. Well, the origin of the term is uncertain, and its precise definition has changed over the years. The term is commonly used today to describe the second full moon of a calendar month, but it was originally the name given to the third full moon of a season containing 4 full moons. We have had a blue moon. The last one was October 31st, 2020. We're not going to have another one until October 31st, 2039, 19 years later. Now, we're not going to address the blue moons in this video, and I probably will come back to this in a future date because these blue moons are markers for, I believe, a very important event. So I'll just leave you hanging there. I apologize for that, but we should not disregard the importance of the blue moons. The calendar we use today is known as the Gregorian calendar because it was introduced in 1582 by Pope Gregory XIII. The Gregorian calendar is an evolution of the Julian calendar, which was introduced by Julius Caesar in 46 BC. Prior to that, though, in ancient Rome, the calendar in effect was the Roman calendar. The Roman calendar also had 12 months, but the first month of the year was March, not January. So let's get back to Bul. The Hebrew word yerach is being translated to month in verse 38, not moon. The Masoretes applied their traditional understanding and used a definition used for Kodesh for the word yerach. It has been tradition to think of this as another name for the 8th month. Yet, Elohim chooses each word with deliberate intention. Bul is not the name of this 8th month. It is the name for the full moon Bul, which means increased produce. Strong's definition states this Bul is related to the 8th Hebrew month, corresponding to modern October, November. This full moon falls after the autumnal equinox because of the increase in produce. We can see these events and on what day they fell. Here you have the full moon, and here's the date. On October 24th, 960, I'm using astronomical dating here. Scripture tells us correctly that this is found in the 8th Kodesh. Because Stellarian software is available to us today, we can find that this full moon is in the 8th Kodesh. I will remind everyone that a Kodesh is not a lunar month of 29 to 30 days. The Disciples' Table has a teaching on the true meaning of Kodesh. If you haven't watched that, you might find that video helpful. Observing a month, a lunar cycle, has been man's way of calculation for thousands of years. This included the means of recording the calendar by both the Babylonians and the Sumerians. So we are arguing against these pressures to conform to the other nations. Consider that in the interests of the merchants who saw increase in their profits, conformity to a unified calendar across borders to do trade and commerce led to their losing the knowledge to read the stars for the beginning of each Kodesh. But this is not Elohim's method of counting days. So when Strong's defines Bul as another name for the 8th month, we hope you will test this definition. We believe that this is Elohim's true calendar. It's made of 12 signs. In Genesis 1:14, he says, "Let the lights be for signs and for appointed times, for days and years." Here we have 12 signs in which the sun enters each and every one. But it will take a different number of days for the sun to pass through each of the signs. We've left the indicators to show you where the 12 lunar months were on the previous calendar. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. However, in a lunar calendar, sometimes you have to add a 13th month. And nowhere in Scripture do we have any reference to a 13th month or a 13th commander for the 13th Kodesh. Elohim intentionally numbered these 12 Kodeshim because through the millenniums, the designated first Kodesh would change, and for the purposes of his heart. In the days of Solomon's temple, the year began with the ram. And in the 4th millennium, in the days of Yeshua, it was the age of Pisces, or the fishes. In the age of Taurus, the bull, a different order of the 12 was in place. And we'll deal with that when we discuss the days of Noah. So there is a shift. Elohim's design is perfection. There is no adding or subtracting from his ways. So let's quickly look at 1 Kings 6:37. Ziv, name of the second full moon in the biblical calendar. Well, that's not what Strong says, but the definition of Ziv is brightness. Strong gives us the definition as the name of the second month of the year, corresponding to April and May. But the Hebrew word used preceding Ziv is Yarach, meaning moon, not Kodesh. We saw earlier a list of names for the full moon in May. One of them was bright moon. The bright moon is a name used by the Celtics, Yalach. It's in May. As Strong tells us, that's an option, but it's in the 3rd lunar month. So how do we test this? The temple construction began in the year of 967. To locate the correct full moon, we need to search first for the sun. When did it enter the first Kodesh? Here is an exhibit of the sun's last second in the constellation of Pisces. Then we have an exhibit of the first second the sun entered the constellation of Aries, the ram. The ram is the first Kodesh in this millennium. Now that we know when the first Kodesh is, we can locate the full moon. And the full moon is March 20th, just 3 days later. Where does the second full moon fall in this year? Here's the last second of Aries of the first Kodesh. Here you're going to see the first second. The sun is now in Taurus, the bull. Now we can look for the moon in this Kodesh, and we will find a full moon on this April 9th, 99.8 illuminated. 8. This moon falls on the 8th day of the second Kodesh. 8 in Hebraic thought means new beginnings. Certainly the start of construction for the temple was a new beginning. The temple was to be a place for the name of Elohim, We now know exactly how many days it took to start and finish Solomon's temple. We are now in the age of Pisces and have been for a very long time. Indeed, bright moon was one of the names used for the full moon in May. When this full moon appears in the age of Pisces, the sun is passing through the bull. But back in the days of Solomon, in the age of Aries, the bull was the second Kodesh, where we just found the brightness moon found in scripture by the name given to it, Ziv. The 8th Kodesh, the 8th sign in the heavens on the ecliptic, is Scorpio. This is when the sun enters on October 20th at 2:34:46. Now we can find the 8th moon. The full moon is on October 24th in 960 now. This is at the end of the building, the day it was completed in Moon Bull, 11 o'clock, 6 minutes, and 27 seconds. That is 5 days. It is on the 5th day. If you watched Elohim, the third word, you know how many times 5 was revealed. Elohim's name has 5 letters. Scripture revealed 25 descriptors of his character in the 3rd millennium. Solomon was the 5th child born of Bathsheba, as well as the 10th named son of David. Solomon became king 35 years after his father was king over all of Israel. There was just so many 5s. And here we have 5. It was on the 5th day of the 8th Kodesh. And 5 means revelation, worship, breath, or spirit. The bright moon was in the Kodesh during the days of Solomon, that the house was finished throughout all its parts and according to all its specifications. So he spent 7 years building it. How many days have gone by between these two dates? 7 years, 6 months, 5 days, or 2,745 days. The date here is not including October 24th. It has been excluded. If my reckoning of days of the week is correct, this last day, if included, would be on the Sabbath day and be counted as 2,746th day from the beginning. And then in my musing, I wanted to find in scripture the 2,746th verse. Exodus 40:38. For the cloud of Yud-He-Vav-He was upon the tabernacle by day, and fire was on it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. Is this a coincidence? We will let you be the judge. He made the moon for appointed times. The sun knows it's going down. The sages say that Noah's ark was completed in the month of Bul. We say it was on the day of the Bul moon. We'll look at that in the days of Noah in part 2.